People keep asking me what I said when I walked through that kitchen door. They want to know if I exploded, if I threw plates against the wall, if I completely lost my damn mind. The answer? None of the above. I barely uttered a word. But by the time that sun crawled back over the horizon, what I did to my own flesh and blood, most folks would label as stone-cold cruelty. I call it survival. Welcome back to Dad's Powerful Revenge. Get settled in and don't forget, every single person in these stories had every opportunity to act right. They just made the wrong choice. Drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. Smash that subscribe button and hit like. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Let me take you back to the beginning, because without context, you'll never understand why I don't lose sleep over a single decision I made. My name is Paul Jarrett. I'm 63 years old. 30 years ago, I married Angela. And up until 11 days ago, I would have sworn on my mother's grave that my family was unshakable. Not flawless, nobody's flawless, but unshakable. The kind of unshakable that gets forged through decades of showing up, paying bills nobody acknowledges, and loving people who sometimes make it damn near impossible to keep loving them. My son Xavier is 29. Full-grown man, broad shoulders, firm grip, decent career. A career, I'll be completely honest, that got a significant boost from connections I personally established for him. But we'll circle back to that. Xavier married into the Dalton family about 2 years back. His wife seems fine, pleasant enough girl. But her people, her father Dale Dalton, her mother Patrice? Let's just say the instant I locked hands with Dale for the first time, something primal in my gut screamed, "Watch your back with this one." I shook his hand anyway. Smiled anyway, because that's what fathers do when their son is head over heels. That was my first critical error. Now, 11 days ago, I flew to Denver for a series of business meetings. Standard stuff. I travel 4 or 5 times annually for work. Angela knew I was going. The whole family knew. What nobody knew, not even Angela, was that my final meeting got scrapped on day 10. I could have stayed, played tourist, ordered room service, and vegged out like a man with zero obligations. I grabbed the earliest flight home. I didn't call ahead, didn't send a text. I wanted to surprise her. 27 years of marriage and I still got a kick out of surprising my wife. Sue me. I landed, collected my luggage, and drove myself home. It was just past 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Now here's the first detail I want you to lock onto, because the specifics matter immensely. When I turned onto my street, I spotted Dale's car parked in my driveway. That silver Buick he treats like it's an extension of his personality. Right there in my driveway, like he'd co-signed the mortgage. That familiar gut feeling flared up again. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe they just dropped by for lunch. Maybe Xavier had invited them over. People visit, it's normal. I was exhausted and reading too much into things. I parked, grabbed my bag, and approached my front door. The house was noisy, but not normal noisy. It was layered noisy, like 2 completely different realities were unfolding under one roof simultaneously. From the back of the house, from the direction of the kitchen, I could hear laughter. Loud, comfortable, uninhibited laughter. Dishes clinking, conversation flowing, the unmistakable sound of people with nowhere to be and not a single worry in the world. And from the living room, silence, the wrong kind of silence. I pushed the door open and I saw her. Angela was on the floor. Not lounging, not resting, on the floor. Her back pressed against the base of the couch, her legs stretched out in front of her, her right hand clamped beneath her nose. Her white blouse had a stain on it that I recognized instantly, and I felt my insides plummet straight through the foundation. Blood. Her eyes locked onto mine the second I walked in, and let me tell you something. I've watched my wife tear up at commercials. I've watched her cry at strangers' weddings. I've watched her break down because a song on the radio reminded her of her late mother. I have never, in 27 years, seen her look at me the way she looked at me in that moment. Like she'd been waiting, like she'd been holding on, Like the second she saw my face, something inside her finally whispered, "He's here. You can let go now." And that, right there, is the image that sealed everything that followed. I didn't panic. Let me be crystal clear about that. I am not a man who panics. I dropped my bag, crossed the room, dropped to one knee, and dialed 911 without hesitation. While the dispatcher walked me through keeping her calm and upright, while I checked her pulse and wiped blood from her face with my bare hand, I could still hear them from the kitchen, laughing. My 29-year-old son and Dale and Patrice Dalton, laughing like they were at some backyard barbecue, like nothing in the world was wrong, like my wife wasn't 11 feet away from them bleeding on the living room floor. I want you to really sit with that for a moment, because I had to. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. 8 minutes that stretched into 8 years. They came in fast, professional, composed, the way people are when they've witnessed real emergencies and know exactly what to do. They checked her vitals immediately, and the lead paramedic, young guy, couldn't have been older than 32, name tag read Briggs, looked up from the blood pressure cuff with an expression that told me everything before he even parted his lips. "Mr. Jarrett," he said quietly, "your wife is in hypertensive crisis. Her pressure is dangerously high. This didn't just happen. This has been building. She needed medical attention well before this point." He said it professionally, clinically, without accusation. And I looked toward the kitchen, where the laughter had finally, mercifully gone silent. And I felt something shift deep inside me. Something that had been hot and frantic moments ago went very, very still. Cold, actually. I held Angela's hand until they lifted her onto the stretcher. She squeezed my fingers. I squeezed back. Twice. Our thing, 27 years of our thing. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward that kitchen. He said it professionally, clinically, without accusation. And I looked toward the kitchen, where the laughter had finally, mercifully gone silent. And I felt something shift deep inside me. Something that had been hot and frantic moments ago went very, very still. Cold, actually. I held Angela's hand until they lifted her onto the stretcher. She squeezed my fingers. I squeezed back. Twice. Our thing, 27 years of our thing. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward that kitchen. Now, before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something fundamental about me. I am not a violent man. I don't scream or throw things or cause scenes in my own home, but I am absolutely, without question, a man who handles business. And it was time to handle some business. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means absolutely everything to us. I've walked into a lot of rooms in my life. Boardrooms where millions hung in the balance. Hospitals where people I loved were fighting for their last breath. Courtrooms, churches, gravesides. I've walked into rooms that changed everything, and rooms that changed nothing. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever felt like walking into that kitchen that afternoon. The laughter was gone, finally, like someone had reached over and flipped a switch. The three of them were just sitting there, Xavier at the head of the table, Dale to his left, Patrice to his right, surrounded by plates of half-eaten food and glasses of sweet tea, like they'd just wrapped up a perfectly delightful Tuesday afternoon meal. In my house, while my wife bled on my floor. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Just stood there. I've learned over 63 years that the most devastating thing a man can do when he's absolutely raging is slow down. Every instinct screams at you to speed up, raise your voice, move fast, make them feel the weight of what they've done. But slow is infinitely more terrifying. Slow means you're in complete control. Slow means you've already decided what's going to happen, and nothing they say will change it. So I stood there, slow, quiet, and I looked at my son. Xavier stood up. I'll give him that. He stood up the second he saw my face, which tells me somewhere in that 29-year-old brain of his, he already knew. You don't stand up like that unless you know. Dad, he started. I held up one finger, just one, and he stopped dead. I turned to Dale first. Dale Dalton, silver-haired, perpetually tanned, the kind of man who'd never worked a job he didn't also own. He had his hands folded on my dining table like he was presiding over a board meeting, like he was comfortable, like he belonged there. I looked at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then I said, my voice so calm it probably terrified them more than screaming would have, "Get out of my house." Dale blinked. Patrice set her sweet tea down. Xavier opened his mouth. "Dad, just let me explain." "I'm not talking to you yet," I said, still calm, still glacial. I turned back to Dale. "Get out of my house, both of you, right now." Dale shifted in his chair and did exactly what I knew he was going to do. He tried to be reasonable, tried to be the measured, rational adult in the room. He leaned forward slightly and said, "Paul, I think if we all just take a breath here." "Dale," I cut him off. "I didn't ask for a breath. I didn't ask for a conversation. I asked you to leave my house. And I'm only going to say it one more time. Now here's the part I need you to pay close attention to, because this is where things get really interesting." Patrice grabbed her purse, touched Dale's arm, and gave him that look wives give husbands that says, "Not now, not here, let's go." Dale got up slowly, the way men do, when they want you to know they're leaving by choice, not by instruction. As they passed through the living room on their way to the door, they saw her. Angela on the stretcher now, oxygen mask over her face, IV line in her arm, Briggs and his partner working efficiently around her. Patrice stopped walking. Her hand flew to her mouth. Dale went completely still, and I watched them look at my wife, at the blood still faint on her collar, at the way her eyes were closed, at the tubes and the equipment, and I watched the color drain out of both of their faces. Good. I needed them to see that. I needed that image burned behind their eyelids for the rest of their miserable lives. They left without another word. The front door clicked shut behind them, and suddenly the house was very, very quiet. Just me and Xavier. He was still standing at the kitchen table, hands at his sides, jaw clenched. He had his mother's eyes, always had, and right now those eyes were doing that thing where they couldn't quite decide whether to be defensive or ashamed. I walked back into the kitchen slowly, and I sat down right across from where he was standing. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and I looked at him. "Sit down, Xavier." He sat. "Talk," I said, "and I want every single detail." He exhaled, ran a hand over his face, and then he started. "And here's where I need you to really stay locked in, because what came out of my son's mouth in the next 4 minutes rearranged everything I thought I knew about that afternoon." Xavier told me that Dale and Patrice hadn't just stopped by. They'd been planning this visit for 3 weeks, waited specifically for me to be out of town, came with paperwork, actual legal paperwork, related to a commercial property I own, a building I've held for 19 years that I've always told Xavier would be his someday. Dale had somehow gotten it into his head that someday meant right now, and that with enough pressure on Xavier, they could get him to sign documents that would begin transferring controlling interest of that property while I was in Denver, without my knowledge, without my signature. I want you to think about that. I want you to really let that sink in. These people came into my home, sat at my table, and attempted to manipulate my son into signing away a piece of what I built while I was 1,100 miles away, and my wife was in the next room. I kept my face completely still. Inside, a completely different story. "And your mother," I said quietly, "where does she come into this?" Xavier looked at the table. "She overheard," he said. "She came into the kitchen about 40 minutes after they arrived. She heard what Dale was saying, and she wasn't having it, Dad. You know how she is. 30 years I've known exactly how she is. She told Dale directly that the property wasn't Xavier's to sign," he continued, "that you hadn't agreed to anything, that they were out of line coming here like this. Dale tried to talk over her, and she got loud. Mom got loud, and Dale got loud, and it went back and forth for a few minutes. and then she stopped. He paused. She said her head was pounding. She was feeling dizzy. She excused herself and went to the living room, and I thought, he stopped again. I was going to check on her. Dale started up again, and I got pulled back in. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat with everything he'd just told me for a long moment. The kitchen was so quiet. I could hear the paramedics talking in low voices in the next room. I could hear the sound of the stretcher wheels on my hardwood floor. Then I said, "So let me make sure I understand you correctly." My voice was different now. Even Xavier noticed. I saw him straighten slightly in his chair. "Your mother told your father-in-law, in her own home, that he was out of line. He talked over her. It escalated. She told you she didn't feel well, and you went back to the kitchen." Xavier said nothing. "You went back to the kitchen," I repeated. Not a question. Just the fact of it sitting between us on the table like something neither of us could move. "Dad, I didn't know it was serious." "Stop." I cut him off. "She has high blood pressure. She has had high blood pressure for 6 years. You have known that for 6 years. The paramedic, a complete stranger, told me tonight that she needed attention before this point. A man who has never met your mother in his life understood the urgency. And you..." I stopped myself because I felt it. That thing you feel when you've raised someone, loved someone, sacrificed for someone, and you realize in one terrible moment that somewhere along the way, something didn't take. I stood up and I said the last thing I was going to say to my son that night. "I don't know who you've been spending your time becoming, but he is not the man I raised." I walked out of the kitchen back to my wife's side. I took her hand, and I didn't speak to Xavier again for the rest of the night. But I want you to understand something. The silence wasn't weakness. The silence wasn't me letting it go. The silence was me thinking. And when Paul Jarrett gets quiet, when he gets very, very still, that's when you should be terrified. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind you get after a good meal or a long laugh or a night where everything went right. I mean the other kind. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes every small sound, the refrigerator hum, the clock on the wall, the distant sound of a car passing outside, feel louder than it should. That's the quiet I sat in that night. Angela was asleep in our bedroom. Finally. It had taken the medication, the lowered lights, 3 of my pillows arranged exactly the way she likes them, and about 40 minutes of me just sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her hand before her breathing evened out, and her face, that beautiful, exhausted face, finally relaxed. I watched her sleep for a long time. I thought about 30 years. I thought about the woman who married me when I had more ambition than money, who worked beside me when we were building everything from scratch, who raised our son with more patience than I ever had, more grace than he deserved, and more love than either of us probably recognized in the moment. I thought about her on that floor, and then I stopped thinking, and I started moving. I went to my desk in the study, sat down, opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and I went to work. Now, I need you to understand something about me before I walk you through what happened next. I am not an impulsive man. I don't make decisions in the heat of a moment, and I don't do things I'll have to undo later. Every single thing I did that night, I had already decided in that kitchen, when Xavier was still talking, and I was sitting across from him with my hands folded and my face completely still. By the time I sat down at that desk, I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided, and there's a profound difference between the two. The first call I made was to the bank. Yes, at 2 o'clock a.m., because when you've had the accounts long enough and you're the primary holder, there's a number on the back of your card that doesn't sleep. I've used it twice in 27 years. This was the 3rd time. Xavier had been an authorized user on my primary credit card for 6 years. 6 years of charges I never questioned, never audited, never made him justify. Gas, groceries, dinners, subscriptions. That one weekend in Nashville he called a work trip that I'm fairly certain involved neither work nor spreadsheets. Removed. The woman on the phone was professional and efficient. Took less than 4 minutes. She asked if there was anything else I needed. Not tonight, I said. Thank you. I hung up and moved to the next one. Car insurance. Dropped from my policy before 3 a.m. The apartment. Now, this one took a little more. I'd co-signed Xavier's lease 2 years ago when he and his wife moved into their place. Nice building, good neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood that requires a co-signer with a certain kind of credit score and a certain kind of income. Mine, I called his landlord at 7 o'clock in the morning when I knew the office would be open. Man named Gary. Good guy. We'd spoken twice before, both times pleasant, both times brief. This time, I told him I needed my name removed from Xavier's lease at the earliest legally possible opportunity, and that I'd cooperate with whatever process that required. Gary paused for a moment, then said, "Everything okay, Paul?" "Everything is being handled, Gary," I said. "Thank you for asking." Every first of the month, quietly, without announcement or conditions, I'd been transferring money into Xavier's personal account. It started when he was getting on his feet after college. Then it became habit. Then it became something neither of us ever discussed, because we both just accepted it as part of how things worked. I logged in at 3:15 a.m. and canceled the recurring transfer. Permanently. Not paused, not reduced, canceled. I sat back in my chair for a moment after that one, because that transfer represented something beyond money. It represented a version of my son I'd been quietly funding. A comfort level, a cushion, a safety net that had maybe, possibly, allowed him to make the kind of choices a man makes when he knows somebody will always be there to catch him. Not anymore. Then came the calls I'm not going to apologize for. Over the years, I'd made introductions for Xavier, opened doors, called in favors. There's a certain kind of currency that takes decades to build, and it lives entirely in other people's trust. I'd spent some of mine on my son. Gladly, proudly. I spent the early hours of that morning taking it back. I called men I've known for 20, 25 years. I was honest without being dramatic. I told them simply that Xavier would no longer be operating with my backing, my endorsement, or my name. That any courtesies they'd been extending on my behalf should be considered concluded. Every single one of them asked if I was all right. Every single one of them respected the call without pressing for details. That's what 63 years of integrity gets you. People who trust that if Paul Jarrett is making this call, Paul Jarrett has his reasons. By 5 a.m., the streaming accounts were gone, the shared subscriptions canceled, and I had a locksmith booked for 7:30. I made myself a cup of coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the sky go from black to gray to the particular shade of pale blue that means morning has decided to show up whether you're ready for it or not. I thought about Dale Dalton sitting in his house right now, probably not sleeping either, probably wondering what comes next. He should wonder, because the property he came to my house to manipulate my son into signing, the one he brought paperwork for, the one he planned for 3 weeks, the one he waited until I was out of town to pursue. I'd already called my attorney at 6 o'clock in the morning, left a voicemail. The message was simple. I need to restructure the documentation on the Garrett Street property. I want it ironclad, I want it airtight, and I want it done this week. Call me when you're in. Dale Dalton would never, not in this lifetime or the next, get within legal reach of anything I built. Xavier showed up at the house at 9 o'clock in the morning. I watched him from the upstairs window. Saw him walk up to the front door with his shoulders set the way he sets them when he's preparing himself for a hard conversation. Watched him reach into his pocket for his key. Watched him try it. Watched him try it again. Watched him stand there for a moment, perfectly still, beginning to understand. He knocked. I didn't answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He called. I watched his phone go to voicemail. He stood on that porch for a long moment, looking at the door like it might change its mind, then walked to the neighbor's house, the Petersons, and I saw Barbara Peterson hand him her phone with the concerned expression of a woman who doesn't know what's happening, but can feel that it's serious. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Barbara's number. I picked up. There was a brief silence. Then his voice. Different now. The defensiveness was gone. What was left underneath it was something raw, something younger, something that reminded me painfully of the boy he used to be. before the Daltons got their hands on who he was becoming. I let him have his silence. Then I said, "You let your mother lay on that floor, Xavier. You knew her condition. You knew what stress does to her body. And when she needed you, her son, you chose to go back to that table." He didn't speak. I could hear him breathing. "I love you," I said. "I will always love you. But love is not the same as access. And right now, every door I've kept open for you is closed." Another silence, longer this time. "For how long?" he asked quietly. "Until you've become the kind of man who doesn't need me to answer that question for him." I hung up. I walked back to the bedroom. Angela was awake, sitting up against the pillows, morning light across her face, looking tired but present, herself again. She looked at me for a long moment. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. I sat beside her, took both her hands in mine, looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you almost lost them, and you need a moment to be grateful that you didn't. "Everything," I said, "is handled." She searched my eyes, then slowly she nodded, and she leaned her head on my shoulder. Outside, my son sat on the Petersons' front step with a dead phone and a declined card and a key that no longer worked, surrounded by the echo of every comfort I'd quietly built around him. Inside, I held my wife's hand, and for the first time since I walked through that front door, I exhaled. Some people will listen to this and say I was too hard on my son. Maybe, but I watched a paramedic, a complete stranger, treat my wife's crisis with more urgency than the man I raised. And I decided that night that the greatest act of love I had left for Xavier wasn't to keep the doors open. It was to finally let him feel what it costs when they close. He'll either grow from it or he won't. But Angela is alive. She is safe. She is home. And that is the only thing that matters. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And share this with someone who will love it. As always, thank you for being a part of this community. I will see you on the next one.